Bem, então, bom dia para todos. Tenho o prazer de receber aqui o Paulo Beramendi, que é originalmente da Galícia, estudou em Santiago de Compostela e também fez o mestrado na Espanha ainda, e depois foi para a Inglaterra, fez seu doutorado em Oxford, e lecionou em Syracuse depois e de novo em Oxford. Hoje está na Duke University. Ele se tornou uma das referências no estudo sobre o federalismo, e um dos indicadores claros é certamente que ele é o editor do Oxford Handbook Series sobre esse tema federalismo. Essa Handbook Series se tornou nos últimos anos a referência para vários assuntos na ciência política. Nós estamos, acho que, 20, 30 volumes agora, e Pablo editou o volume sobre federalismo. Recentemente, ele publicou um livro, The Political Geography of Inequality, onde ele trata, onde ele elabora uma nova teoria sobre como regimes federais lidam ou produzem e lidam com a desigualdade. Vocês já percebem que não estou muito seguro no assunto, mas a gente tem a enorme sorte dele falar hoje sobre justamente esse tema. Então, com isso, eu passo a palavra para ele. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. I will speak English during the academic talk, although I can take questions in Portuguese as long as they are not very fast. I think I will be able to understand. I want to begin by thanking Marta and the department and the university and Tiago over there, who sort of guided me through the perilous waters of the city of Sao Paulo yesterday for a wonderful stay and for a wonderful visit in which I have learned a great deal about the specifics of Brazilian federalism, Brazilian economic geography, and Brazilian political economy. Actually, in ways that are very relevant for some of the things I want to talk about today. Today I'm going to present what is a preliminary paper, or a first paper of a sort of longer, hopefully eventually will be a book project, in which we try to understand the relationship, or the relationship between geography, the fiscal capacity of the state, and the comparative politics of inequality. The ultimate object of this project is to try to understand variation over time and cross-sectionally in the levels of inequality. And what I am going to propose today is a few thoughts on what we think, and this is a joint project with Melissa Rogers, who did her PhD at UCSD and is currently at Claremont University, so this is not just my work. We're going to propose what we think is a sort of a reasonable contribution to try to understand why some countries are able to overcome the curse of inequality, and why some countries are stuck in it, despite the fact that sometimes, occasionally, elect leaders that seem to be very willing to fight it. Okay. So the talk, I was told I have between 45 minutes to an hour. I'm very bad with time, so if you see that the whole thing's evolving slowly, make some gestures, just Graham, send me some signals. But I'll try to stick to the time, or not to fall short. Sometimes I'm so worried about going long that it goes very fast. The talk unfolds in 4 steps. First, I'm going to present some motivating evidence as to why we think that this is an important problem to resolve, and what we think is the issue in hand here. Then I'm going to spend some time explaining what the logic of our argument is, and the predicted, sort of the empirical implications that follow from the argument. And then I will present the 2 bits of the empirical analysis that we have some leeway on by now, which is, one is of a more cross-sectional nature, and the other is exploiting time variation in our data. And then finally, I will try to wrap up with some provoking thoughts that will trigger discussion about what the potential contribution of the project is, and what its many limitations are. I am used to be yelled at by my students, by my colleagues, by my wife, by my daughter. So if there is something that is completely incomprehensible along the way, feel free to interrupt. So the economics rules sort of apply in my department, and I wouldn't consider it impolite to be interrupted in the middle of the talk. Quite the opposite. I'll be worried that people are not with me along the way. So let's define. Here we have a first graph in which the top panel here is the level of income inequality across the 50 or so countries that we have collected information from. And the x-axis is the level of social expenditure as a percentage of GDP, and the level of investment in education. And clearly the relationship is negative on both ends. So the motivating message of those graphs comes from the literature on advanced industrial countries that somehow suggests that the secret to reduce inequality is to be able to make a lot of effort in the correction of market outcomes through taxes and transfers, and that would be the left part of the chart. And this is what we would call an equalization of outcomes, okay? And the right chart is related to the second form of equalization that is arguably more effective, which is the equalization of opportunities to do well in the job market. That is what some people in the investment-oriented literature call redistribution. That is interventions that try to equalize the ability of people to make money in the private sector, rather than equalize the final outcome through post-tax and transfers interventions. And the bottom two panels tell us a story that those two things are, this is sort of a Piketty moment in which there is an accounting identity that is transformed into an argument. Those two graphs are telling us that the ability to make a huge effort in terms of either correction of market outcomes or equalization of opportunities has to do with the amount of tax revenue that you're able to collect. Okay? There's a very strong positive linear relationship between how much tax revenue as a percentage of GDP a country is able to collect and the effort they can devote to either correct market outcomes or equalize opportunities through education. I am perfectly aware that the automatic connection between education expenditure and equalization of opportunity is problematic, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But just as a motivating chart, this is telling us fiscal capacity is a precondition for the politics of equality to even unfold, for governments to even be able to make decisions about how to allocate resources. The same point is conveyed in this second motivating chart that relates, that builds the link between capacity and inequality in a different way. The left chart here is telling you what the relationship between a proper measure of tax capacity and the measure of tax collection is. And here we see a very strong positive linear relationship. The correlation coefficient between these two variables is above 0.8. Now, it is important to understand what those two variables are. Okay? The x-axis is a measure of bureaucratic tax capacity. It tells you how many tax employees a particular country has per 1,000 inhabitants. Okay? It's the ratio of tax collection investment in the state. What is the state capacity to collect taxes, okay, relative to the population? And it tells you, it's a measure of how much a particular government has been able to build a stock of tax agencies. And the y-axis is the standard measure of tax capacity that we all use, but that it is conceptually imprecise, which is total tax revenues as a percentage of GDP. Why is this measure imprecise? It is imprecise because it reflects both capacity and choice. A country the level of revenues collected by a country is a function of two things: how much revenues they can collect, and how much revenue they politically choose to collect. Okay? And those are not the same thing, but it turns out that they tend to be very close together. And this chart is important because it validates, as a proxy for tax capacity, something that we're going to be using later on as our dependent variable for tax capacity, even if it is conceptually a little bit more imprecise. The unfortunate case is that the measure of tax capacity is only available for 1 year, for one small period of time, 2009, 2010.
And the number of cases in the left chart seems to be smaller than the other, right? The sample.
Yeah, because the tax revenue data comes from the full sample that we have, and that's a sample that goes from the late 1950s to the 2010s, and we lose quite a few observations if we want to use the full average collection capacity for the entire period. That's the reason. Now, the right axis is the SALT measure of income inequality. This is post-tax citizen transfers income inequality as it relates to the level of tax capacity. And again, there's a very strong relationship between the two. Okay? Tax capacity is a precondition for the politics of redistribution, for the politics of equality, for the politics of inequality to unfold. And so what we want to do in this paper or in this project is to endogenize it. Okay? It's basically, okay, if this is an important feature that clearly seems to be highly correlated with the amount of political intervention, both on the correction of market actors' outcomes and on the equalization of opportunities towards a sort of a more equal outcome in the labor market, we have to understand where it comes from and why is it that we see such a huge variation across developed and developing democracies. The countries that we have here are only democracies, but are one of the things that this paper does is tries to combine democracies that have the typical OECD democracies with democracies that are sort of the middle and even some low-income countries as well. It's a first attempt to try to combine the politics of redistribution in those two subgroups. There's a lot of literature on the politics of redistribution in the OECD, where everything is about partisanship and coordination and you name it. And there is a lot of literature on, there is some literature on the politics of redistribution and inequality in the developing world, which is much younger and is now unfolding, and it tends to pay attention to a different set of factors. So what we're also trying to do in this paper is try to sort of get these two subgroups of countries into a common theoretical and analytical treatment. And the idea, the fundamental intuition is the politics of inequality is as much about what governments can do as it is about what governments cannot do. Okay? By looking at the determinants of capacity, we're thinking of an incumbent in a country with historically low levels of fiscal capacity that arrives with a very strong mandate to increase the levels of redistribution and pursue equality politically. How we know that those incumbents cannot fix 200 years of inequality in one term or two. They can do some things, and they do a lot in relative terms, but there is that much they can do. And what we try to understand here is what drives that much they can do. I'm thinking of people like Felipe González in Spain in the early 1980s, when he arrived to essentially oppose 40 years dictatorship country with very limited fiscal capacity that it still shows today. I'm thinking about what's happening in Greece. I'm thinking about what's happening here. I'm thinking about what's happening in Argentina. As opposed to what would be the opportunities for an incumbent in a place like Germany or England or even the United States or Sweden. Okay. Now, this is not the first paper in which we're trying to look at fiscal capacity. There's an emerging literature on trying to explain the tax capacity of states that points to several factors. One is the usual storied war. Charles Tilly, Martin Checo, more recently David Stasavage and Ken Sheedy have all made arguments that wars are extraordinary moments in which the fiscal contract is renegotiated due to external pressures. Okay? Trade, the expansion of international trade, forces countries to renegotiate the internal composition of sectors, and that triggers negotiations that usually involve increases in the levels of fiscal capacity, and this is basically Grossman and Helpman in a more economics perspective, and Didac-Herald more recently as well. There's the perpetual institutional account that is implicit in Besley and Person's book, Pillars of Prosperity, and is implicit in Asimov and Robinson. Good political institutions, good legal institutions breed good fiscal institutions, and vice versa, and they reinforce each other in a recursive, self-sustaining equilibrium. Nobody quite knows well yet where it comes from, but it is there. And there is, of course, a line of reasoning that goes back to sort of Adam Przeworski, Asimov and Robinson, and more recently has been revisited by Maris and Gerald that triggers fiscal capacity, and I have a paper with Didac as well on this, back to extensions of franchise, democratization, and internal elite competition. What we want to do in this paper is to sort of enter into a dialogue with this literature and argue that fiscal capacity is ultimately an endogenous centralization problem shaped by geography. Okay, what we have at the beginning of the modern fiscal state is a bunch of lower level units with some resources that have to come together into an agreement about how to develop a strong center. And a strong center oftentimes means a strong fiscal center that is going to reallocate resources across the units, and with what consequences. Okay? And what we want to do is to go, so by introducing this geographic dimension into the problem, we want to go beyond arguments in the political economy of development that we consider to be highly deterministic. So there is this whole literature on tropical underdevelopment, there is this whole literature on crops, and there's some crops here and some bad outcomes there, and there is a correlation between the two that is fairly strong, and we're going to find that as well in our data, but we want to tell a sort of a more political story as to what exactly is the mechanism between the two, we're connecting the two, and we want to go beyond what we consider to be fairly artificial debates between geography versus institutions. If you see the recent quote-unquote fights between Asimov and Robinson on one hand, Jeffrey Sachs on the other, it quickly degenerates into my variable is bigger than yours, and it's sort of an either-or debate. That doesn't have to be that way. It is not either. It's not a race of the variables in a regression, so to speak. It's more like how do these things connect together in a political story. Okay. So to do that, we think of fiscal capacity as a conflict between elites, and elites that care about two things. They want to maximize economic gains in the short term, and they want to maximize political influence in the medium to long run to protect their relative position if it's good, or improve it if it's bad. Okay? Now, there is nothing particularly new here. We all can buy the assumption that elites want more resources and more power. The key actors are defined in a rather sort of axiomatic and abstract way as those key players that bridge the transition between the pre-industrial and the industrial world. And those three actors are rural elites, industrial elites, and workers. Now, those who have read the paper will have noticed that the workers somehow disappeared from the paper later on, because I'm focusing on a period of history, and the workers play a very important role for other parts of the book project, and I'm presenting the general framework, but for what I'm going to tell you later, they play slightly less of a role. But what is important is to understand what they assume preferences that we sort of impose in the analytical model or framework, it's not yet formalized, are. So for rural elites, in terms of economic gains, they would like to preserve the pre-industrial status quo. There's a pre-industrial status quo bias, which they intend to protect either through supporting autocratic regimes by preventing the rise of democracy, and this is basically what happens in many European societies, and I presume elsewhere, or if they cannot stop democracy, they will try to impose high levels of malapportionment because they tend to be located in fairly underpopulated areas that fear what they would call the tyranny of the majority. Okay? Industrial elites have a different set of preferences. They would rather see more investments in public goods, and by public goods we basically are thinking about large transportation networks that benefit the transportation of input goods and output goods, education of the labor force. As the Industrial Revolution unfolds, we see large investments in public education, and this is a story of Lindert about England and Germany in trying to understand the rise of the fiscal state. And they want, historically, some input into the political process that preserve their, we're assuming they would want some input into the political process that would allow them to maximize their influence, but not too much, okay? They want to alter the playing field, but not too much. They want to generate a demos that is convenient for them, but excluding the majority of workers that would make different sets of demands that would actually jeopardize their political and economic position. And then come the workers, who want basically a broadening access to public goods, which would in turn imply an increase in fiscal capacity. And of course, typically, we would assume that workers' movement and parties, and maybe this is a European bias, you can correct me, want full democracy. They're behind extensions of universal franchise movements and better apportioned systems that would remove the sort of the punishment of being concentrated in urban cities that Jonathan Rodden has been talking about for a while. Okay, is everything clear so far? Yes? Okay, now, the key point of the paper today is that how the power struggle between these three groups unfolds is not random. Like the balance of power between these three groups in different parts of the world and in different times of history is not just the luck of the draw, it's a function of two things that are intimately connected with geography and the economic geography of the country. And this is the next step of the argument and the discussion of the two mechanisms. The first one has to do with how geography shapes the timing and the scope of industrialization. Economic historian Robert Allen, who has just retired from National College, has written a masterful book called The English Industrial Revolution in a Global Perspective, in which he sort of offers a reinterpretation of the English Revolution as a revolution that occurred not because there were a lot of property rights or because there were good political institutions. He argues convincingly those things were present elsewhere in the world, but because those factors, which were important indeed, combined with a very high level of agricultural labor costs at the time. Okay. His explanation of the English Industrial Revolution is something like high wages, cheap coal, cheap energy. Okay? That's the key to understand the English Revolution. There is a demand side and there is a supply side that explains industrialization. Industrialization is essentially a demand for technological innovation that reduces labor costs. And it's going to happen when this demand, which is motivated by the presence of very, very high labor costs, is going to meet the political conditions that facilitate the supply of technology and the response in terms of public goods provision. So how does geography fit into this picture? Well, the argument we make is that there is a relationship, and this is not necessarily our argument either, that between geography and the distribution of agricultural labor cost. Okay? Geography affects the agricultural suitability and the cultivation skills, and it affects population size. You can develop different forms of agriculture depending on the physical geography of the land, and this is going to carry an effect not through inequality, a la Engelman and Sokolov, or not necessarily through inequality, not directly through educational institutions, as the papers by Galdor and others say, but we argue critically through the distribution, the territorial distribution of agricultural labor costs, which are important because they drive the demand for technological innovation and drive the demand by elites for essentially the steps that will take a country into a further stage of the industrialization process. So certain aspects of geography will delay the arrival of industrialization. It won't prevent it. It's not that industrialization hasn't happened in Spain or Argentina or Brazil. It has happened later, in part because of this sort of demand side argument. And it will happen, but what matters is that it will matter through another mechanism, which is what the scope of industrialization is. Certain types of agricultural production are going to be much more concentrated territorially. Okay, and the demand is going to come in late, and it's going to come in much more narrowly in terms of the territorial spread of the installation. And this brings us to our second mechanism, which is one very dear to my heart, additionally, which is the concentration of economic activity in the territory. Okay? Late industrialization processes tend to be very concentrated, and that matters for a number of subsequent aspects of the process. It matters because the concentration of economic activity is going to be related to the ability of maximizing political influence. And it matters because it's going to increase the opportunities for elite collusion. Okay? A more concentrated economic geography means that all production in the country is in one or two places, which means the economic and political elites of those places manage to hold a lot of power and influence the national rules of the game in ways that work to their advantage. Okay? And that shapes the distributive conflict, okay, in ways that ultimately constrain the development of a strong, centralized fiscal state. Okay? As opposed to a situation like in which the fact that agricultural labor costs are high and spread across much of the country, which is what happened, for instance, in England, then you're not going to have these sort of local elites capturing the entire political process at the national level and shaping regulations, economic policy, and fiscal policy in such a way that the investments into fiscal capacity are going to be much more limited. Now, what do we mean by, so when you combine these two factors, you have a 2x2, which is the favorite tool of teachers in the world. And you have sort of high and low rural labor costs are going to shape the demand for technological innovation and industrialization. And you can have societies that are much more concentrated economically. That means the elites are going to be much more located in particular points and much more homogeneous. Or societies in which the patterns of economic activity are much more spread out and dispersed across the territory, which is going to be associated with a more heterogeneous elite and subsequent patterns of elite competition. Okay? In the first case, we're going to see rural elites intervening, shaping, controlling, oftentimes benefiting directly from the early stages of the industrialization process. We're not going to see independent competing industrial elites emerging against the old land aristocracy, as we see, for instance, in England. In this particular case, in cases in which we have diverse economic trajectories across regions, we are going to have a clear conflict, which is the one that has been studied by economic historians in many European countries, between these sort of new, up-and-coming industrial elites and these old agricultural elites. There is going to be much less overlap. Okay? So the combination of these two dimensions will allow us to think about what are the best conditions under which we're going to see larger investments in fiscal capacity. Investments in the development of national public goods and investments in the development of large-scale educational efforts to educate this growing labor force that the industrialization process is going to bring. And this is what we're trying to understand. So you have. Is there a question? No.
Não. O Rio, ele estava sugerindo uma conexão que é o seu próximo slide. Aí eu disse, ele está no próximo slide.
Okay, so you have a country that has low demand for industrialization and everything is extremely concentrated. You're going to have a very late industrialization process with huge levels of elite homogeneity and very late efforts to invest in fiscal capacity. If you have a country in which some parts of the country have in which we have, when this society, sorry, I was, for a moment I blanked out. When this society moves from this equilibrium, as all eventually do, no country gets, I mean, that's probably not true. middle-income countries typically do not get stuck forever in a rural equilibrium. Eventually, the push for industrialization arrives into it. Then we're going to have a situation in which the concentrated economic geography moves to a situation in which rural elites try to control and interfere with the industrialization process. Okay? Now, if we start from a situation in which the original distribution of economic activity is more spread out, but some parts of the country have low demand for industrialization, then we'll have a situation like the United States, okay, in which we have a sort of growing industrial area in the Northeast, the Iron Belt from the lakes, Chicago, etc., up, down until New York, and then the rural South, which is sort of a Spanish equilibrium inside the Federation, and we all know how that all ended in 1864. But eventually, we have basically a diversity of economic trajectories that leads to some form of compromise in the very form of the political agreement and in the very form of the development of the fiscal capacity of the states. The compromises that these political elites will make among themselves are going to matter a lot to understand the dynamics of fiscal capacity across US states and at the federal level. And only when you have a spread out economic geography with high labor costs, okay, you're going to have an early push for industrialization. And that's where you would expect the highest levels of fiscal capacity. Now, these are familiar pictures to everybody. This is the economic geography of Brazil. This is the level of contribution to GDP by Brazilian state in 2006. I'm sure if I covered these names, you would be able to tell me which state is which without even reading them. Okay, that's an example of a very, very, very strongly localized process of economic modernization and eventually political modernization. As you can see also by the distribution of railroads. Okay, the map to the right. All the action is here. And a little bit in the northeast. Along the coast. Okay? But this is Brazil in 1959. This is the railroad network in 1959, which is where my understanding is the industrialization process is beginning to sort of really explode in the economy. This is your neighbor to the south, Argentina. These two bars are Buenos Aires and the city of Buenos Aires. The state of Buenos Aires and the city of Buenos Aires. And then the rest of the country. And this is the railroad network. Okay? Everything is localized in one point. By contrast, this is England. Okay, I'm sorry, the resolution is very small, but this is England in 1845. Okay, these are railroad networks. Okay? Which reflect the willingness of elites to connect different parts of the country for the purpose of production, distribution, and consumption. Oh, sorry. These are 1854. Okay, the Industrial Revolution is sort of beginning to really take on. This is England at the time in which the rest of Europe is beginning to industrialize, the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, and this is at the beginning of the First World War. And
this
incredibly
line,
integrated territory. Yes.
Those lines are railways.
Yes.
Ah.
Yeah. Everything is railroads. I'm obsessed with railroads. I'm having a team of people. We are building maps for every country in the world at the pre-industrial time and early years of industrialization, trying to, with GIS software, trying to capture the territorial spread of the railroad as an indicator of investment capacity. We need to get better data to understand these things beyond the government financial statistics and other exercises in creative accounting that we all rely on. So, this is a story in which then we have to go from this general meta-centuries framework into the data that we only have for a period that goes between 1950 or around until the late 2000s, first decade of the 2000s. Okay. So we don't really have a time series from the 1880s, 1890s, etc. So we need to build an empirical connection in the absence of some direct measurements of key variables. So what is the proposal we're making in this paper is we're assuming that there is a connection between, well, we're not assuming, this actually we show, that there is a connection between large-scale agriculture and geography, okay? That this is going to create very high levels of elite homogeneity that we do not measure directly, and that this is going to be a strong predictor of the level of malapportionment in a country during the period for which we have information. And the level of malapportionment hasn't changed very much across our sample over time for those 50 to 60 years. I mean, there are some modifications in some countries, but it's a pretty sticky, steady environment. We can show, and for this we have direct measures, and this of course is a proxy, our large-scale agriculture is a proxy for the distribution of labor cost. We do not measure agricultural labor cost directly. There's only a handful of countries for which we have systematic data on rural labor costs before the Industrial Revolution. Nothing that would allow us to do a regression with 50 observations. Okay? So we have to believe the assumption that the structure of rural properties has something to do with the distribution of rural labor costs. And that assumption is validated by a few observations and a few in-depth studies, but based on sort of a comparison that Alan did between Mexico and England. But we cannot measure those things there. Okay? But we are basically building this empirical connection this way. And this is sort of a premise in the analysis. Then we have a second step in the empirical analysis in which we have to establish that geography is that these variables capturing the diversity of the historical diversity in economic production are going to predict regional income differences today across all of our countries. And this is one of the biggest contributions of the paper, is that we have a measure, which is our key independent variable, of the Gini coefficient of regional GDP per capita across all of our countries. Okay? And this is calculated for all of our countries, and this is what Melissa had done before we met. This is calculated for all of our countries at the level of state. The equivalent will be the recetas estaduales, or the Spanish autonomous communities, or the American states, or the German Länder, or something. And in the countries in Europe in which the frontier is vague, we use the NUTS 2 Eurostat level. And NUTS 2 is how they call it. I'm not making that up. So the idea is that geography should carry an effect, a long-standing legacy in terms of regional income differences. And then yes, we should see that fiscal capacity today is a product of the interaction between regional income differences and malapportionment, holding all the other theoretically relevant determinants constant. Okay? Now, of course, this is a measure of inequality, or a measure of a very important dimension of inequality. This is a measure of the capacity of the state to reduce inequality. Okay? So we have a gigantic endogeneity problem in terms of the assessment of these empirical relationships. How do we break that up? What's the methodological strategy to try to parse out these three hypothesized relationships in a context in which you have only observational data? The experimental revolution hasn't reached my sort of historical taste yet. I cannot randomize the Industrial Revolution. I wish I could. We have basically observational data with a huge time lag. Okay? So what we do is two things. We do two things. One is we follow the strategy that Asimov and Robinson did in their paper, Unbundling Institutions. This is actually a serious paper in which they try to sort of predict an instrument for the long-term legacy of the determinants of institutions. And it's a strictly cross-sectional analysis with instrumental variables, in which the dependent variable is tax capacity. The independent variable of interest, potentially endogenous, is the level of cross-regional income inequality. And this is instrumented by two things. Okay? Two things that we consider to be prior and exogenous to the Industrial Revolution, and that we consider to be determinants of the degree of concentration of economic activity. One is regional variation in the distance to navigable waters, which we have computed by looking at, using GIS, the distance from the historical capital in each of these states to the closest source of transportation through water, and average regional variation in average yearly rainfall. We assume that these two things are not determined through a feedback loop from sort of industrial production during the period of interest. Now, we may be wrong with yearly rainfall and global warming, but let's just take that, let's just put that aside, okay? And this is the variable of interest that has taken quite a lot of effort to produce, to be able to capture this dimension of the legacy of industrialization across space over time. This is what we think this regional income inequality variable is ultimately captured. So this is the set of predictions of what are sort of our instruments for regional inequality, distance navigable water, and yearly rainfall, and the story in which we see if there is a relationship between these two proxies for the suitability of land and geography for the development of agricultural production with low labor costs and the scope of malapportionment. Okay? We are controlling for federalism in the case of malapportionment and for a bunch of other things in the case of regional inequality. The details of that are in the paper. The emerging message from this preliminary analysis is that the premise that geography is the sort of structural geographic variables that cannot be taken to be assumed by feedback consequences from industrialization and fiscal capacity are good predictors of both malapportionment and regional inequalities. And then we take the second step and predict the level of fiscal capacity, which we measure through two variables: tax as a percentage of GDP, tax take as a percentage of GDP, as I showed at the beginning of the talk, and this RPE, which is the relative capacity index, which is an attempt to come up with a better measure of fiscal capacity by looking at the relative differences in extraction between a country and the average capacity extraction in all the countries similar to him that have the same structural level of economic inputs. So to the extent that a country is deviating down from the mean of societies that have the same structure of economic inputs, whereas you could assume that the fiscal capacity of that state is relatively weaker. The results are robust to whatever measure we take of fiscal capacity, and they are also robust to using tax take as a percentage, tax take relative to population, tax take to capital, as opposed to GDP, to try to keep the influence of the economic cycle out. So what do we find in this cross-sectional analysis? We find, to understand what we find, what we have done is to break down the predictions in the following way. Here we have a picture of various marginal effects of malapportionment and on tax collection, okay? And so this is the average marginal effect of malapportionment, which is telling me that malapportionment tends to reduce inequality in observable, not inequality, it tends to reduce tax capacity in observable and significant levels at low levels of regional inequality. So when you have countries that have lower levels of regional inequality, then an increase in the levels of malapportionment is going to imply a reduction in the levels of tax capacity. Now, what we do here then is we go from the average marginal effects to linear predictions to actually be able to plot as well the substantive effect of the variable. Okay? And here's what we find. For countries with perfect apportionment, okay? Countries perfectly apportioned with low levels of inequality, okay, would have a prediction of tax capacity of around 40%. holding all the other factors that drive fiscal capacity on their average. Okay? And as regional inequalities increase, so imagine that this dot should be the Netherlands, okay? In terms of a sort of actual understandable case in the sample. As the Netherlands becomes more and more like, say, the United States, the prediction of the data is that we would have much lower levels of tax revenues available for the government, okay? This country here is a country with no regional inequality and median levels of malapportionment. Such a country does not exist. But suppose that the United States, which is a country that has median levels of malapportionment in the data, would have no regional inequalities. Again, as we move the level of regional inequality for 0 to the maximum, the degree of tax capacity collection declines. Okay? And interestingly, when we have very, very high malapportionment, there is no discernible effect of regional inequality at all in the cross-sectional analysis. That is, with the data that we have in the cross-sectional analysis, high levels of malapportionment and very, very high levels of regional economic concentration seems to be perfect predictor of each other. And we cannot distinguish in that particularly subset of observations any marginal effect of one relative to the other. Okay? That's what the story is telling us. But the story is telling us that there is indeed a conditional relationship between malapportionment and regional inequality that is consistent with the theoretical expectations that we have. Okay? Now, what do we do then to parse out the effect of regional inequalities and malapportionment? We need to come up with an empirical strategy that allows us to assess what the effect of a regional change, of a change in the patterns of regional inequalities that is exogenous in nature has in societies with different levels of malapportionment. Okay. We need to have one of those two variables fixed and one of those two variables changing for reasons that have nothing to do with what we're trying to explain. Otherwise, we will be sort of spinning our wheels or producing donuts, and that's not good. So, what we do to do that is our second step in the empirical strategy, which is to exploit the food commodity shock of 2007 and 2008. In 2007, 2008, we had a huge increase in agricultural produce prices, okay? Tied together with a huge increase in oil prices. Okay? To the extent that countries have different patterns of economic geography, and some areas are much more concentrated on agricultural produce than others, this should matter for the patterns of regional inequality a great deal. Okay? And these are shocks that we assume to be exogenous to the specific local political context of particular unions, of particular federations, or particular countries. We're assuming that this sudden shock, and this is what happens to the food price index between 2007 and 2011, okay, is exogenous to the politics of any particular subnational unit. Okay. And what we do then is we use one of those tricks that observational researchers use to try to pretend to be experimentalists while we're still doing observational data, which is this difference in differences estimation. What difference in difference estimation is nothing but a comparison between two groups and 2 points in time. Okay? The point in times are defined by a break that is supposed to be exogenous, and the two groups in our analysis is malapportioned countries versus non-malapportioned countries. So what we do is we compare the distance in terms of tax capacity between the malapportioned countries and the non-malapportioned countries before, the distance between the malapportioned countries and the non-malapportioned countries after, and then we take the difference of the differences. Okay? And that difference of the differences will give you a sense of the impact that this structural break associated with regional economic geography will have in the predicted levels of tax capacity. Is this clear? That's how it is. So the pseudo treatment group is, I guess, malapportioned countries after the break, and the or the control group would be malapportioned countries before the break. If you want to think in terms of lab language, that is a bit of a stretch, given the sort of data we have. We do that, again, controlling for all sorts of potential covariates. We use lag-dependent variables, year fixed effects, country fixed effects. It's robust to the inclusion of a control for changes in growth to avoid sort of confounding effects of the Great Recession, which is, the food prices index, also, of course, at the time in which Europe goes into a massive financial crisis. So we need to control for that. And basically, we get a very robust pattern of results whose key predictions look like this. This is the level of the marginal effect of malapportionment on tax capacity before 2007, which is interestingly very, very similar to what we found in the cross-sectional results. Okay, before the external shock, there is no discernible marginal impact between the two variables that conform our theoretical model. But once we have a radical exogenous change in the patterns of regional inequality, we find this incredibly sharp decreasing slope after 2008. Okay? So clearly, we are seeing a significant change of the relative standing of malapportionment relative to tax capacity after the levels of regional income inequality have been suddenly transformed for exogenous reasons. And what we see here is that with confidence intervals, the story is mostly driven down as the level of malapportionment goes up. Okay? What we're doing here is just draw different predictions for different subgroups of countries with different levels of malapportionment. And what we see is that when the regional inequality exogenously changes, the sharpest decline in tax capacity takes place precisely in the countries with highest levels of malapportionment, which are the countries where either the winners of the price shock can protect their revenues from subsequent tax intakes, or the losers of the price shock cannot pass fast and speedy compensation measures that would require increases in tax capacity. And that's about it in terms of empirical analysis. So what we're trying to do in this project is take a step back and trying to explain the origins of one variable that we all take as given when we do our analysis. Not we all, that at least I have taken as given until now. I shouldn't accuse people of doing the mistakes I make. And when we're trying to predict or when we're trying to assess political determinants of inequality or of inequality. We bring in a different set of mechanisms than other literatures that have been sort of contributing to this analysis so far. This focus in geography and long-term legacies in fiscal capacity allows us to understand within group variation in terms of the literatures on the relationship between war and fiscal capacity. One of the problems that we have with the literature on war and fiscal capacity is there are huge variations in the level of fiscal capacity, both within countries, among countries that went to the war, okay, and among countries that never participated in major international conflicts. So that within group variation can be in part explained, we argue, by the sort of story that we are telling. We're also making a contribution, I think, to this literature, trying to unfold the relationship between geography and developmental outcomes. So we have the perpetual Asimovon and Johnson story about how centrist mortality changed demographics, and that somehow facilitated the incorporation of property rights early on in certain parts of the world, and that creates some sort of old magical outcomes. And then we have a literature that looks at tropical related variables or temperature-driven variables, rain, etc., and then relates that directly to GDP per capita today, without much concern for a sort of political story about the intervening mechanisms that connect these two variables. Okay, so we are fully in agreement with that correlation. What we're trying to do is say, okay, what is the political process that explains that correlation in the longer way? And then we have the a third literature that is beginning, an example of which is a recent paper by Victor Rinaldo and Michael Albertus, that looks at the legacy of economic and political transitions and the ability of elites to preserve their relative standing even in the next stage. So the paper by Albertus and Rinaldo makes an argument that says, to the extent that old elites managed to influence the way transition to democracy occurred, we're going to have a democracy that's going to be much less effective in doing certain things. We're trying to bring an argument that explains both why some elites are managing to steer the process more effectively and what the implications of that for fiscal capacity is, which is something this literature has to look at. In terms of next steps, what we're going to do is select a few countries, and this week has been very good in terms of thinking of Brazil as one of those countries, to analyze this in depth over the long term and really map the implicit mechanism that is in this story, which is how elites manage to steer and survive these transitions over time. Okay? If this argument is true, we should see that there is a lot of elite competition and elite removal and elite renewal early on in the process in some countries versus others. And we should see that there is more elite homogeneity in countries with more geographic concentration, less elite homogeneity in countries with less geographic concentration. And in terms of dynamics, we should also see that the elites in places like Argentina or Spain or Brazil are able to perpetuate themselves through overlapping connections across the economic and political institutional setup. And what we're trying to think is ways of measuring that network of power influences and the direct connection between that and the formulation of economic and fiscal institutions that are behind fiscal capacity. Thank you for your attention.